Welcome to another IMA panel, the Independent Media Alliance. Today we are discussing a fantastic article put out by Catherine Austin Fitts in regard to the coming digital control grid. Now, we've all been doing a lot of work in a lot of different ways, discussing sort of the building, the Great Reset, essentially. Every single data point around that conversation that seems to have continued under the US government of today. And so we wanted to discuss today the different points of where that's been building, what we can see, and talk about the possible solutions around each one. So thank you all for being here today. We want to kick this off with Catherine Austin Fitts telling us about her article, and then we can go through the points. So go ahead, Catherine. Nope, you're muted, Catherine.
Still muted, Catherine.
Yep. Okay. Here we go. Thank you, Ryan, and thank you for pulling us all together and gathering us this way. I recently published an article called, let me just get back to it. You threw me off there.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Wait a minute. The fast approaching digital control grid, a checklist of Trump administration actions to date. When Trump, right after he was inaugurated, he did a press conference with several big tech billionaires and announced initiatives, the Stargate initiative, to put together data centers all across the country and combine it with mRNA injections. And it was clearly a major step forward in building an AI engineered control grid. And he announced energy policies that would support it. And so I put together an article literally in the first couple of weeks that showed all the different things the Trump administration was doing to build a digital control grid. And what I discovered with that article was that many people, they see the individual pieces, but they don't see how they come together in a control grid, which completely overruns the US Constitution and changes our fundamental governance structure, including moving control of fiscal policy and taxation to the central banks. And so, ever since that article, I've been tracking and just amazed both at all the things they're doing to build the digital control grid, but also all the things they're not doing. If you were serious about reverting the corruption in the last 4 or 5 administrations, they're not doing any of those things. So, or I should say, they're not doing very many of those things. They've done a few things that, in my opinion, create great headlines, but they're minor. And so I put up a new piece where I just extended the old piece, and I went sort of through my summary, and then I went through different categories. The first, let me just describe the categories. The first was money. The second was the war on cash. The third was financial disclosure, which to me is a major, major issue. The fourth was digital IDs. We've never seen an administration more aggressive on digital IDs, which we know is the next big step to building the control grid. And then digital payment systems. And then finally, let me go down, the Internet of Bodies. And that gets into the mRNA, telecommunication systems, changes in assets and how federal assets are managed, and finally energy, because we know that the digital control grid is unbelievably energy consumptive. And then finally, looking at both budget, Federal Reserve, and some other minor things. And, by gathering everything together, it was funny, people kept asking me about, why do you think they're building the digital control grid? And Ryan, literally the list got so long that I found myself doing interviews and forgetting to mention one. So I thought, okay, I need a checklist. So this is Catherine's interview checklist, or that's what it started out at. But as you can see, there is extraordinary number of items, and this is not an accident. People say, well, we're sure Trump doesn't know. Of course he knows. This is obvious. Anyway, so my hope is that because there are so many real solutions, but they all require us getting out of the pendulum between what I call the political version of your food choice is McDonald's or Burger King. Your political choices are not, one part of the uniparty versus the other part. We have real choices, but we have to just leave the pendulum between the different parts of the uniparty behind. And my hope is that this will help people see the different parts of the digital control grid coming, and understand their time is much better spent. Instead of watching TV and being entertained by Donald Trump, it's much better spent stopping the Real ID or working with state legislators to do things to protect financial transaction freedom. Anyway, so that's my introduction. I really appreciate all you guys coming together to talk about this, because anything we can do to help people see how these different pieces snap together in literally a digital concentration camp. And the more people who create friction and refuse to go along, the better off we all are.
Couldn't agree more. And since we got everyone here now, we can go through the quick roundabout here. We have Jason Burmis today, Ian Davis on the top right, Steve Poikinen, Kit Knightley in the middle, Catherine Austin Fitts, Derek Brose. And, in general today, Catherine, is any spot that you'd like to start on in regard to the list, or should we just start with the top with money?
I would start down, because we sort of go inside out. But
Perfect.
Let's start with money and essentially destroy, ending currency as we know it.
Yeah. Well, as you write in the basic summary, an all digital currency and monetary system is essential to institute a digital control grid. So different than the actual digital monetary system around it all, the specific digital currency dynamic. And you mentioned the Genius Act, which I was looking over a second ago in regard to the, kind of like the stable coin, the legislation that's going forward. So anybody want to jump in and kick it off? I mean, obviously there's a thousand directions.
Can I just mention one thing on the Genius Act? So Trump has made a big deal about, we're not doing CBDCs and we're canceling CBDCs, and people think that has meaning. But if you look at the CBDC, it would have been done by the Fed. So primarily the lead would have been the New York Fed. And if you look at the Genius Act, it's just saying all the guys who own the Fed are going to create subsidiaries and do stable coins, which is, is basically programmable money with less oversight by Congress. So it's sort of, meet the new boss, same as the old boss. There's, it's a different version of CBDC.
Right. But worse, as you're pointing out, there's less oversight. So it's the same problem, but far, just a worse version of it, which is such a typical way this always goes, where they give you something everyone wants to push back on. But usually you get like a less bad version that you accept. This just seems like a worse version, but it's more of a kind of a shell game. So anybody want to jump in on that topic? Digital IDs, like, the way it all connects, or specifically, back to digital currency in particular and how we see that going. Any thoughts jump to mind for anybody?
Well, we've seen the rise of Brock Pierce, right? Jeffrey Epstein's good buddy in Tether, kind of taking a major foothold in what is going to become not necessarily like CBDC, but the face of U.S. stablecoin going forward. And there's been, $700 million invested, and then another round of several $100 million invested, all to position Tether, and again, Brock Pierce, in this particular position of leverage. And we're kind of finally seeing like the merger of PayPal Mafia and cryptocurrency all wrapped in with a nice tight federal bow. And did anybody vote on this? Was anybody asked about this? Did anybody give an opinion to where it may be in the contrary of, no, I would rather not have my entire financial system be on a blockchain where at the whim of some bureaucrat I can have my entire life shut off? I don't think any of this occurred, but it's still happening. And the people that are assembled here and a handful of more people are about the only ones willing to say anything at the expense of algorithmic reach, or, the expense of our shows or whatever else we're trying to put out.
Yeah. I'll go ahead, Jason.
Well, I'm not sure whose feedback that is, but there is some feedback.
Yeah.
I would say this. I mean, right now, we're in the first 3 months of the administration. I think it's pretty obvious, or it should be to most people, that inflation is going nowhere. And I really don't know how it could really go anywhere after they printed all that money up during the COVID 1984 nightmare. I think that the talking points of going into Fort Knox and the New York Federal Reserve are great. I don't think they're ever going to come to fruition. I also believe that most of us kind of saw the headbutting of Powell and Trump in these rates, and all the while, what's happening right now? Gold is exploding as a hard asset. Silver is doing very well, and Bitcoin is back on the rise. And I would imagine with the right economic turmoil and headline, we could see Bitcoin actually not go to 1 million. You know, those people are always going high, but maybe reach a high of 120, 125,000. What does that mean for the next, market in crypto? I think you see Ethereum and all these meme coins explode. In fact, Trump, I just saw a report today, is going to be having a meeting with the top holders of his meme coin, right? Remember when Trump came out and that just exploded? So I think there's going to be a lot of exploitation on that level as they move more people into the comfort of using this device on the blockchain. For instance, Venmo, PayPal, you can buy Bitcoin on there right now. You know what I mean? And I'm sure that's going to go into more and more crypto. I think they will hedge their bets. And, you know, kind of like we talked even before the administration took place, we all know that a digital currency is part of the plan. So that's going to be pushed forward. I mean, to imagine it would not be when Peter Thiel was such a huge part of the push at the very end of this administration getting in, you have Vance, et cetera. I don't know what the public's going to think about it. I mean, I think if you keep it so people can still afford things and you still have the rhetoric on television, unfortunately, I don't know how we get back to a pushback on that. I don't believe anybody here thinks that we're going to get an honest audit of the Federal Reserve, et cetera. I'd love to see that. You know, there's been talks of Ron Paul. Those talks went away very, very quickly. So unfortunately, you know, and in this very first part, Catherine talks about an AI and crypto czar. You know, one of the things that wasn't really highlighted in the article that's extremely concerning to me is that, well, AI is a buzzword. We've not taken out the government fascistic aspect of AI, in that the chief AI officer, artificial intelligence officer program, is still going. And that means that our government is literally involved at the Defense Department level on every company developing both software and hardware in this regard, and essentially decides how far it goes. I mean, all these companies are being audited by the government. And again, the only ones that are beyond this audit are government agencies. It says it right in the CAIO doctrine. Anybody can read right now. So that's extremely also concerning when we're talking about cryptocurrency, because they are going to end up going hand in hand. I don't want to take too much more time, but unfortunately in this regard, I don't necessarily know how you slow this down. And instead, I think that people are going to have to navigate it by, multiple investments in multiple things, and really hard assets and resources like actual physical property, like you've done, Ryan, owning your own home, owning your own piece of land, knowing your neighbors, et cetera, creating your own barter type systems, which still do exist in pockets of the United States outside of these big cities that they don't want to tell you about, even in the big cities as well. So that's kind of my thoughts on the monetary system. I would love to believe that we're going to have some kind of quote unquote golden age and economic boom, but I only see really that economic scale up if people start adopting the digital grid, right? Then they'll give them a little bit of a bone to encourage other people to get on the train before they pull the rug out.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to jump in real quick if I can. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah,
cool.
A little echo.
Yeah, Catherine, thank you for putting that together. I was just looking over. I hadn't had a chance to look at it before today, but I think it's a great summary of everything going on, and for people to really get a grips of the role that the Trump administration is playing. I just wanted to add two things. One, for a brief moment, to say, I told you so, and to go back to some articles that I wrote at the Last American Vagabond prior to the election. And, when a lot of people didn't want to listen, pointing out all the connections with Peter Thiel, the connections to Elon Musk, of course, the military-industrial complex, et cetera, et cetera. And thankfully, more and more people, I think, are listening. Of course, there's the diehard MAGA folks who aren't going to hear anything we're saying regardless. But I do think even those who are optimistic and skeptically voting for Trump, or, just didn't like Harris or whatever, and felt this was the only choice they could make, are now starting to see a bigger picture. I'd also like to point to, I don't know if you already have it pulled up, Ryan, or not, but we just published a new article I wrote at the Last American Vagabond yesterday called Welcome to the Palantir World Order, which kind of picks up on the threads that you were pointing out, Catherine. There's just one area I did want to mention just in terms of the finances. I found a report from ProPublica talking about Peter Thiel, a Peter Thiel funded company, as well as connected to all the usual players, Andreessen Horowitz and David Sachs is in there. The company you guys may have heard of called Ramp, which is a financial company. They focus on doing AI software for businesses, kind of helping them analyze their finances. And I've seen more and more people using this company. But ProPublica is reporting that there have been 4 private meetings recently with Ramp executives and the Trump administration's appointees to the General Service Administration, which obviously focuses on federal contracts. And you look into who Ramp is. Of course, they're funded by Peter Thiel through the Founders Fund in 7 different rounds. They also have Keith Robos, I think is how you say his name, Kozla Ventures, with also Thrive Capital, which is, of course, Joshua Kushner, Jared Kushner's brother, Trump's son-in-law. And then 8VC, which is a venture capital firm funded by Joe Lonsdale, who is, of course, another co-founder of Palantir with Peter Thiel and Alex Karp. And so the General Service Administration, which handles federal contracts, is now potentially going to partner with Ramp, which is a total Peter Thiel cabal fund company, to start handling some of their federal contracts. So just another piece of that puzzle of how this the Thiel acolytes and those connected in that whole universe are getting further ingratiated there. I also want to point out, we did report it last American Vagabond months ago, and I know we talked about it on our previous panels here, the role that Howard Lutnick is playing. Steve mentioned Brock Pierce. But Howard Lutnick as well is a big component of this and a big piece of the puzzle. His connections to Tether, of course, him as Commerce Secretary. Again, I say it half jokingly, but also like, I told you so, we told you so. The information was all there. So no big surprises for me, but hopefully putting it together in this format that you have, Catherine, as well as the article I just put out, which similarly tried to just summarize all these different areas that we're seeing Peter Thiel connected companies. And of course, Palantir directly, Palantir partnering with the IRS, SpaceX and Palantir saying they're going to build the Golden Dome over America. Palantir helping ICE find immigrants and probably more people in the future. And then, as I mentioned, the payment platform, also Peter Thiel is getting involved with nuclear energy through a company called General Matter, which is starting to partner with the Department of Energy. So just there's so many examples. And of course, that doesn't even get into Israel and the connections there. So, I mean, even going beyond just the focus of the digital aspect, which is obviously a big cornerstone of the puzzle, we're seeing Palantir and Peter Thiel and the whole PayPal mafia all up in the federal government, various contracts in different ways.
Most definitely. And I think there's a surveillance point where I'm going to definitely bring a lot of that in regard to Palantir in particular. It's a total information awareness, like obvious kind of development, but and excellent points in general. To the actual Ramp point you brought up, and I was curious if Catherine or anybody else, what your thoughts are on this, because I had this pulled up in the overlap to the digital currency conversation. Now, any real financial dynamic like this would be one more way they could kind of coerce you into that. But I wondered, Catherine, anybody else, if you have any thoughts on this program?
So I just wanted to jump in because and pick up on a couple of things that Derek said. One, if you look at if you and I were, if this group of people were to go into the U.S. government and say, we're going to get to the bottom of where the fraud's been going on and stop it, we would have gone to HUD and DOD. If we said we're going to build a social credit system to control, what we would do is we would go to the Treasury payment data, the Social Security payment data, and the IRS payment data, which is exactly where they went like a heat-seeking missile. And we would basically download that data and provide it to our partnership between Musk's AI company and Palantir. And if you read the Wired reports, that's exactly what they did. So, at one point, Naomi Wolf said that's $1 trillion worth of data. And in fact, if you look at high quality payment data of that kind, I don't think that's an unreasonable estimate. So, if you look at the data game, they are clearly building, the control grid, and Palantir's role in this is critical, which is why I'm so glad you guys have published this recent piece. I also want to mention something else. Does everybody remember when we would send over pallets of cash to Iraq? Okay. Stable coins working through mobile payment systems are the new pallets of cash that are going to go global. So this is just like one company used to tender for the stock of another company in the market. The US is planning using stable coins, which of course bring more money into the dollar and the dollar market share. They are literally, through the mobile payment systems, going to try and tender for as many citizens worldwide as they can get into the system. And if you look at some of the planning, not only do they plan to send out the stable coins, but they're planning on issuing, it looks to me like massive amounts of credit. So literally everybody around the world can borrow money in stable coins, and then they get you on the stablecoin platform. So it's going to be, and they think they can get billions of people moved into the dollar channel through stablecoins. And if you look at their sort of vision of where the dollar system is going to go, it's absolutely critical. So this is a completely global game. The other thing I wanted to mention is right now, inflation was caused by the massive injection by the Fed during the going direct reset. But the thing that is pushing inflation now and is going to continue to push it is deglobalization. Deglobalization is very inflating of the real cost of goods sold, but it's happening on the real side, real asset side of the balance sheet. And I think part of what they're hoping to do is match it with this unbelievable flood of stable coins and credit that they're working on, which is I mean, if you think we're in a ridiculous debt bubble now, where do you see this? This is going to be something else.
I want to just jump in real quick on Thiel, just quickly, because you mentioned the nuclear aspect of the investments. We also have to remember that Thiel was essential in the rise of Facebook. Obviously Palantir is concerning. You mentioned Alex Karp. Bilderberg's coming up literally, I think, within the month over in Switzerland. I'm going to be keeping my eye on that. But one of the things that has been downplayed is the fact that we've had Meta now announce that they're building a data center in Kentucky, almost the size of Lower Manhattan. And they'll have all the energy in the world, again, to run these AI data centers. Well, it's Meta, it's Google, et cetera, that have now invested in these mini nuclear plants that they are going to have supposedly on site. So they plan on powering these things with mini plants around these areas. So remember what I just said. These centers are the size. Go watch the map overlay of Lower Manhattan, how big this will be. Think about that for a moment. That type of technology is now going to be fast-tracked, not for you and I, not for cheaper power, but for AI-driven authoritarianism. I mean, that's a legit point that no one seems to be talking about. And again, Thiel was essential in the come up of Zuckerberg, Facebook, Meta, everything. And just one more point on social media. We had that executive order, and I was very skeptical of it in the beginning. I think we did a forum on it, where we're going to stop the censorship of social media. Where's that? That's not real. Even yesterday, I posted, I've got dead kids in my feed every day. I don't know if you guys saw it, but twin girls, 4 years old in Gaza, dead. I reposted it. I said, hey, when am I going to stop seeing dead kids in my feed? I had people, and now they weren't in the United States of America, but they're not allowed to even watch that video in Europe and places in South America. They comply. And that's X, that supposed free speech platform with his Muskernuts friend. So I'll stop my little tirade, and I will allow somebody else to comment.
Yeah, going back to what Catherine was saying there about the global nature of this, and obviously we're talking about the impact of people like Thiel and Musk and Andreessen and people like that in American politics, and their impact and leverage in the Trump administration. But if you go back to, I think it was 2009, Thiel wrote an article where he spoke about his ambitions to create, and this is a direct quote, a new world currency. Well, if you consider,
it was 2010, and we just played the full text of it on the show yesterday. Yeah.
So the notion of creating a new world currency with using dollar-backed stable coins, I think that if you can look at a plan, I think, that was at least being thought about in 2019 in terms of making it a practical plan. And it's something that I always refer to as a speech that Mark Carney gave at the G7 symposium in Jackson Hole in 2019, where he spoke about this notion of what he called a synthetic hegemonic currency. Now, shortly following that speech, that's when Facebook, which obviously Thiel was, instrumental in, and I think Zuckerberg, when Thiel left the board of Meta, but when it had become Meta, I think he was quoted as saying that he considered Thiel to be a mentor in business, in industry, and in life. So Zuckerberg was obviously impressed with Thiel. And this notion of this synthetic hegemonic currency, Carney said that there were options on the table. So, things like central bank digital currency, but also in particular, a stable coin started by Facebook called Libra, which then became Diem. And that stable coin, funnily enough, Facebook itself in an SEC filing, I keep saying Facebook, but I can't remember quite when they became Meta, but in an SEC filing, they openly stated in that filing that they didn't think that the Libra project would work because they realized that the regulation wasn't in place to allow it to work. So also, when you think about the people like Thiel that have got they're very close to people that are obsessed with this notion of something called accelerationism, which is wrapped up in this notion of something called the dark enlightenment and all this. They believe in creative destruction of markets. They think this is an important tool to be deployed. Well, if you look at Libra, that looks like an aggressive attack on the monetary system in terms, if you consider the monetary system to be a market, that was an aggressive attack on that, and certainly on the traditional role of the central banks in terms of them being able to issue money. That created the framework for the regulatory process. And we had people like Thiel and Zuckerberg were meeting with Trump during his first administration in private for private meetings when Zuckerberg was being quizzed about Libra in front of the world and certainly in front of the Senate and in front of various committees. They were having private meetings, and lo and behold, shortly after those meetings, the Diem project, which it had become by then, suddenly became, it was going to be backed by a basket of currencies, and then it was backed after these meetings. It was suddenly going to be backed 1-to-1 pegged to the dollar to the US dollar. Well, when you look more closely at the notion of interoperable currency, which is what the Bank for International Settlements has been absolutely obsessed about for many, many years, we've already seen things like what a team at Warwick University, they've already onboarded in the US using from fiat to a stable coin, a USDC stable coin. So this was Circles, and then offboarded at the other end in France directly in euros in real time across borders with very, very, very low transaction fees, with a transaction that tracked exchange rates by 0.02%. So that 0.02% variance was more than saved. Was more than covered by the extremely cheap transaction fees. So they are building. I suggest, and I think that the US move towards US dollar backed stable coins is very much part of this. They are building a global network of interoperable digital currencies. And I think the more that you look at it, think about what Carney might have been talking about when he was talking about a synthetic hegemonic currency, is that rather than having and he was very much concerned about protecting the power of the dollar as well. And clearly, with people like Thiel backing things like Paxos, which is a which is a one-to-one US dollar custodian of its digital stablecoin. Things are moving in that direction, and it would seem that that in all likelihood, a US dollar denominated stablecoins are going to be the dominant kind of currency in a new model of international monetary and financial system, which is going to be wholly synthetic and therefore centrally controlled.
So, Ian, let me ask you a question. It looks to me like they're building this parallel track with stable coins so that they can bypass a lot of the national controls in the current banking system. So you're looking in a funny kind of way, you're doing same old, same old. You're just skipping all the different toll booths. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, I think things are still up in the air. I think there was a notable exchange between Augustine Carstens and I can't remember her name now. She's an academic anyway.
Lagarde? Oh no!
No, it wasn't
I
Lagarde.
know
No,
what you're talking about. Yeah,
she was an academic, and
yeah.
he was saying that if we're going to have these stable coins that are backed by US treasuries, why shouldn't we just use CBDC, wholesale CBDC and trade assets as we normally have, but just use wholesale CBDC? And her response to him was, well, why should we bother with this third party? Why do we have to trust central banks with all their strange biases? Why can't we trust Paxos?
No, so I'll tell you why. Right now, under the law, the Fed's problem is it cannot do CBDC without authorizing legislation, and it still is under the rubric of Congress. And it's one of the reasons they're trying to get a constitutional convention. It's one of the reasons they've been trying to wiggle out. But right now, the Fed has too many disclosure obligations, and Congress still has jurisdiction. And that is a real sticking point if you have to go get legislation and admit what you're really going to do. And stablecoin is a way to do the same thing because it's the owners of the New York Fed who are going to control all the stablecoins. And there's one layer removed between congressional oversight, and you can have a lot more secrecy and wiggle out of Congress. That's why.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, if you think about the implications of what Trump was talking about in terms of freedom cities, so this notion of these deregulated, anything goes, sort of free for all development zones where the multinational corporations can research and develop to their heart's content, then companies like Tether will be able to do whatever they want with regard to the development of their stable coins within those freedom zones, literally beyond the jurisdiction. Well, it seems like from what they've suggested, beyond the jurisdiction of the federal government, if they establish these quote unquote freedom cities. So they are trying to create a privatized, a totally privatized international monetary and financial system. I think.
I think you're right. And the question is whether these development zones, whether Prospera dynamics or not, are actually just another part of that same agenda, and they're just being, presented that way. Like in Prospera, using Starlink with the same, Teal funded. I think it's kind of like trial balloons for the same problem, and it's they're using cryptocurrency. It's all kind of the same thing. But I think you're right. The way you can see this developing is clearly from a globalist perspective. I want to point out though from Facebook and Libra, like imagine if that was Iran that did that, where they just allowed this to go. It's clearly being allowed. And what I think is interesting to what Catherine was bringing up in her article, the Genius Act itself, as I think you were kind of alluding to, clearly highlights that only the federal entities are the ones that are allowed to now do this, and they're just kind of taking control of the dynamic within it all. And I think that in coupling that with the real ID, national identification, it's just I don't know why people can't see how this is developing, whether or not they want to admit that this is their plan. It is the same agenda, which is kind of like the larger thing we're talking about today. I don't know if Kit, you wanted to have any comments on this.
I did. I just was going to say that if you look at the history of the central bank digital currency issue, like it explodes in 2020, and I think it was quite interesting. we got to the point in like late 2021, early 2022, where basically something like 150 of the 194 global nations are all developing their own. And the stick in the mud on this issue was, weirdly enough, usually the United States. All these countries were publishing reports saying digital currency is going to be great. And Congress would publish reports saying, yeah, but it might not be so great. And I think there's lots of issues that go into that. I think some of it was a fear from like the empire head nation that it would undercut their legislative power. And some of it is the odd position that America is in, like economics wise, where they use a lot more cash than a lot of Western countries do. And so you have this sort of transition rebranding, as Catherine said right at the beginning. Basically, they're going to do a central bank digital currency. They're going to call it something else. And as Ian pointed out with the interoperable issue, they're going to do a global currency, only it will be called 150 different things. It's very much a question of linguistics and branding more than anything else.
Yes. Well,
let me also just really jump in. I think also technology. And what do I mean by that? You know, if these people had their way, and Catherine talks about the Internet of Bodies pretty extensively in the article, they would love the Sam Altman WorldCoin brand, where in order to actually transact on this thing, you give up your biometrics out of the gates. So while you're right, I do believe it's going to be, 150 different things. I think that they're going to integrate different types of technologies. And just like you see with the consolidation of everything, they will weed out the ones that are less efficient and less surveillance, and then ultimately try to get even beyond what Altman is doing with WorldCoin.
Yeah, and usually by some rationalization by, demonstrating why the ones that don't spy on you are not working as well, the efficiency dynamic, and, justify it in that way.
And there's also there's the question of how you get people to go along with it as well. Because like, I know just from, if we have something called the digital pound in this country, we don't yet, but we will. And if we have it, and you have to give up your fingerprints or your thumbprints or your retina scans or whatever to use it, people will be much more likely to give that up for a digital pound, which is an extension of something they know, than for the global world coin, which is a brand new thing they don't. Right. So you sort of have to use that language to get people on board. This is a digital dollar. It's like the old dollar, and you need your fingerprints.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the same with, they've got this notion of what they call vendor agnostic. So with digital ID products, the United Nations, certainly, and the World Bank like to use this term vendor agnostic products. So it's independent. The creator of the product is independent. It's not part of any kind of collected network or anything like that, despite the fact that they talk about everything being interoperable in terms of its machine readable messaging exchange systems. So already they've started talking about ISO 2022 compliant digital ID products. So even though they're all produced by different people, and then they look different, they say, somebody might be using Real ID, somebody might be using a European driving license or whatever. They're all made by different companies, IDEMIA or whoever, but they all have an exchangeable machine readable data, so that can be exchanged. And the World Bank have already toyed with this ID4D idea of having a universal ledger for all digital ID, which would just simply gather up this data from all digital ID products. Well, with regard to stable coins, there are already stable coins that have been issued with, and I was struggling to remember the names of them, which are using the same kind of what we might call vendor agnostic technology, i.e. that they're all built on platforms and on blockchains, which have but to an agreed standard and I think SWIFT have already spoken about the stable coins that could adopt this interchangeable or interoperable
since 2023.
Yeah, so it's another ISO or standard for machine readable digital interchange, information, and there are stable coins that are already compliant with that. So this notion of a kind of global network of vendor agnostic digital currency products all working together, and if the Bank for International Settlements gets its way interchangeable across borders instantaneously, you start moving to a situation where, I mean, I've questioned whether even what the value of things like a reserve currency would be in such a system, because
the
if you can,
reserve currency is based on what's already been stolen, Ian.
Yeah.
Like I mean, you know that. It's based off of what's already been thieved. And then going forward, anything that's described as a stable coin just means regime approved. It doesn't mean that there's any actual stability to it. It just means that, the overarching economic sphere that's been in control for the last, many centuries is still in control. That's all a stable coin means. Yeah, Catherine, I know you wanted to chime in.
Oh, I just wanted to mention one of the things you see that's very interesting. So we have lots of collections of short videos up at Solari, and I put a link in the chat to the financial transaction freedom videos. It's about 100 short videos, starting out with a famous one of Karsten's basically saying we can make the rules and enforce them centrally. But the second one is Neil Kashkari, a former Treasury official who used to be or is now president of the Minneapolis Fed. I don't know if can you play it, Ryan? It's only a minute.
You're muted, Ryan.
The Carson one?
No, the second one.
Okay, go ahead and keep talking. I'll grab it.
Okay, so what you're seeing is the more and more people start realizing how this stuff really works, you're finding all sorts of people with very successful careers or wealthy in America saying, wait a minute, if we don't have our fundamental freedoms, they can take all our assets. And they're starting to realize that they're on the menu. And here you have a president of one of the 12 Federal Reserve banks saying Americans should never do a CBDC. And for the reasons, the same reasons I'm sure he would know why they should never do, interoperable and programmable stable coins. Anyway, if you want to play it, Ryan, it's just a minute and it's very impactful.
Yeah, I just noticed in the chat, Derek, did you want to comment before? If you have to get out of here?
I can wait till after Catherine.
Okay, let's play this first.
Asking anybody at the Fed or outside of the Fed to explain to me what problem this is solving. I can send anybody in this room $5 with Venmo right now. Right? No, seriously. So what is it that a CBDC could do that Venmo can't do?
Is that it?
No, that's not it. Is there any reason it stopped?
No. I don't know why. Well, here, let me go ahead. Yeah, it seems to be playing in the background. Hey, but let me remove it really quickly and add it again. See if that works. And I'll bring up Derek's article if you want to talk about this, Derek.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I don't want to intrude, but I wanted to go back just briefly to the point that Ian was making about the Freedom Cities. This was reported earlier in April by Reuters about, of course, Ken Howry, who we pointed out months ago is connected to Peter Thiel, and they've got him now in the position of ambassador for Denmark, which is, of course, part of their desire to make Greenland part of the U.S. as they build the tech native North America. This report is just showing how, I think you mentioned, Ian, did you mention Praxis? I think you did. And
I didn't, but yeah.
Okay, well, so this ties into some of the companies and some of the things you were talking about. Praxis is one of the companies. There's also another one called Promos, I think it is, and Pronomos Capital. And this is tied to Andreessen, it's tied to Peter Thiel, tied to Lonsdale, again, the whole PayPal mafia. But what this article is just talking about is that these discussions are already ongoing, and that whole cabal is already one of the places they're planning to do it. And this may be one of the reasons, besides resources, they're so interested in Greenland. Apparently, they're already in discussions. According to the article, Praxis co-founder Dryden Brown told Reuters that companies have already approached them about helping them to establish a so-called Freedom City in Greenland. And this is just part of that overall move. So whether or not it happens in the U.S. or the Trump and his team really do try to take control of Greenland in some capacity, these ideas are being discussed, and it's the same people tied to Prospera in Honduras, which Ryan mentioned. You have what's his name, Friedman, the grandson of Milton Friedman's involved in that. Patty Friedman, I think. Joe Lonsdale, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, of course. So yeah, these discussions are ongoing. And then I just want to insert one other thing before I do have to head out in just a couple of minutes, because I was reading some of the comments, and I know that people in all of our collective audiences maybe know some of these details, if not all the details, and if not all the specifics. And they're, I think, counting on us in some ways, maybe unnecessarily, to also think of solutions. What are we actually going to do about this? Because we're describing a world that each of us know there is no existing within it and still maintaining freedom and privacy, that there has to be alternatives. This is what I've tried to focus on quite a bit. So I just want to encourage everybody who's listening to this to take heart that, the Independent Media Alliance is about trying to raise awareness and talk about things that you might not be hearing from others in the mainstream alternative media, but we're also very much aware of the need for solutions. I know Catherine's focused on this as well over at Solari, and others have. So, we don't have the perfect answer for you and your life necessarily. Everybody's got different resources, financial situations, desires, et cetera, but absolutely we need to resist these systems as much as possible, whether that's at the airport, whether that's real ID stuff, whether that's, just checking out at an Amazon store at the airport that they want you to use, check touch-free everything. You just have to resist these things in all the ways you can, big and small, including using cash, including rejecting the systems that they're trying to put before us. And I do think local community is super key on that, because I don't know if any of us can do it in isolation. It's going to take us coming together. I don't think there's very much hope of any sort of political solution to prevent what we can see is on the horizon. So if we're going to, if we're not going to wait on that and not just trust the plan, then we need to count on ourselves, count on our communities, our churches, whatever it is you got, your own family, extended family, and really start having these hard conversations. So find the people near you who care, who can see what's going on, and start having those conversations. And then more importantly, start coming up with an action plan. Or where's your red line in the sand? What are you willing or unwilling to do? If it means maintaining privacy and freedom into the long term, not just for your life, but for the coming generations. Because if you don't know where that line is, then the next thing you're just going to accept the digital IDs when they roll out. You're going to accept the facial recognition at the airport. And then before you knew it, all the things you've been watching podcasts about and watching documentaries about for years are going to be your reality. And I don't think anybody wants that. So yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there.
I'm glad you brought it up, Derek, which is funny. We discussed before starting that one of the central parts of today was to discuss the solutions. What's funny is we haven't even gotten past point one. It just shows you how much information there are around so many different things. And so we can just use that as a segue. I'll play the rest of that clip. Hopefully that plays for you, Catherine. And then we can talk about the potential solution.
Okay.
Specifically for the digital currency. So let's see if this plays.
Asking anybody at the Fed or outside of the Fed to explain to me what problem this is solving. I can send anybody in this room $5 with Venmo right now. Right? No, seriously. So what is it that a CBDC could do that Venmo can't do? And all I get is a bunch of hand waving. I get well, maybe it's better for financial inclusion. Maybe it's better for cross-border remittances. Maybe. Is there any evidence that it is? And, they say, well, what about China? China's doing it. Well, I can see why China would do it. If they want to monitor every one of your transactions, you could do that with the central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. If you want to impose negative interest rates, you could do that with the central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. And if you want to directly tax customer accounts, you could do that with the central bank digital currency. You can't do that with Venmo. So I get why China would be interested. Why would the American people be for that?
Good question. What are your thoughts, Catherine?
Okay, so here we have the president of one of the 12 Federal Reserve banks in 2023 at Columbia saying we should never do a central bank digital currency. So I think one of the reasons the Fed has been slow walking this, number one is they have to get legislation, and they can't get legislation without telling the truth about what they're really up to and having a debate that they wouldn't win before the election. But the other thing is you have many, many people throughout the institutions of the United States they don't want their grandchildren to be slaves. So I think, the more knowledgeable people get about what's really going on, the more you're gonna see real friction in the system, and that's positive.
So
I agree.
I'd love to jump to just solutions and to the very end of the article to kind of piggyback on what Derek was talking about on kind of it's going to take more than one person and many people coming together. And then Catherine in the chat talked about states being able to change things. So here I am in Iowa, and one of the things that just visually and verbally bothers me that I actually share with my nieces, they see me physically get angry, is when I see the spraying in the skies, right? I don't include them in much, but when I see that, boy, that makes me angry. As you know, I put out a film in 2013 called Shade the Motion Picture, going over the bioengineering, the geoengineering, Bill Gates, all this stuff. And here we are. So the reason I bring it up with solutions is kind of a frustration point as well, but people coming together. Here in Iowa, just about 2-3 months ago, my state senator, a representative named Jeff Shipley, who I've had lunch with, is a very good man, actually brought legislation, anti-geoengineering legislation, to the House, to the state. And people got to speak and the whole nine, and they tried to ban it. Now, my friend Todd McGreevy, he runs a print publication here called the RC Reader since 1994, and he spoke there. The Democratic opposition came to speak. Todd was very familiar with this gentleman. He was kind of surprised that he was here. He's wondering why he was there. Well, he had his whole little canned speech ready to go. And that canned speech goes like we've heard so many times. There is no evidence that this is actually happening. But if they are doing this to protect me from global warming, I want to be safe. So in basically a paragraph's time, they go from it doesn't exist to if it's good for me and I think it's good for me, we're going to do it anyway. So to me, yes, we can change things as a state, but we're still in the baby steps of something that everybody in the world can look up and see. And, I was on with Gareth Ike a couple days ago, and right before the show, what does he bring up to me? The United Kingdom and European legislation that they're going to begin to block the sun openly. And I'm like, hey, join the party, pal. They're just doing it here for 30 years and nobody's see. And I've said this to other people, and I wonder if I were to run for governor of Iowa and win, could I stop this? Or is it just so far up the military industrial complex where I'm just going to get a big FU? I don't really know the answer, but I do know the answer that Derek and Catherine talked about are at least the first steps in trying to change this overwhelming system. And I'll leave it there.
Well, you have to stop it where it starts. And we have a little bit of proof of this out here in California. There was a pilot program out of Harvard in 2022 where they were like, let's just spray, silver iodide into the atmosphere. What could possibly go wrong? And a bunch of people went, no, you can't do that. So they said, okay, we'll relocate the program to the deck of the USS Nimitz in the Alameda Bay. And then we'll spray silver iodide into the atmosphere. And all of the people in the immediate, Alameda County area were like, what are you doing?
Well, you know what?
Why would you do that?
Can I jump in really quickly? Let's do since we're at the beginning of the conversation, let's bring it back to the focal on digital on digital currency, and we can. But there's a good point to bring to the broad point of in a general sense how we can effectively create change in anything like this. And I think it is important to highlight the fact that I think, as you're highlighting, Jason, almost all of these, in my opinion, supersede the idea of even a federal government. That's my personal opinion, and from a globalist sense, so it really is look at it that way. But I'd like to get some solutions focused specifically on the digital currency dynamic. So the Americans or anybody else in the world who is feeling forced into the idea of digital currency, what are our proposed solutions for finding a way around that? And as Catherine pointed out, from a state perspective, states' rights, that's one way to look at it. But anybody else want to jump in for that?
I think, I would support, something that Catherine's spoken about a lot. And that is just carry on using cash. Just use cash. Or not even carry on using cash. Make a point of using more cash.
Let me just jump in for a second, though. If I want to go to the UFC tomorrow in Kansas City, Missouri, zero cash. I don't even get a ticket. So there's no cash. Listen, there's no cash in the venue.
Jason, I want, this is not 0 or 1. Jason, it's not 0 or 1. Yeah, if you look at how cash works, if you use and insist on cash every time you can, wherever you can, you push it back. It's not 0-1. So I'm not saying don't go to the UFC,
Sure.
although it's a good idea to say to the UFC guys, what are you trying to do? Bring in digital slavery and push back on them? No, really.
You're
So
right.
I got to tell you,
Yeah.
I have watched so many people in our network get off the couch. They knew nothing about state legislators. They knew nothing about the local school board. They knew nothing about, they have gotten legislation passed. They have gotten bills passed protecting cash. They have gotten debanking stopped in their states. They have gotten so much done. If everybody would just get off their couch and pick the one thing or two things they could do and use cash whenever they could, and stop financing and supporting the people doing this, stop going to work and building the control grid, there would be an absolute revolution.
Catherine, the problem is nobody wants to get off of their couches.
That's not true.
Already
There are a tremendous number of people getting off their couch. I work with them every day all over the world. They get off the couch, and you know something? They're having fun. They are having a good time. That's how we find each other.
These are all really important things to digest with all this. And I completely agree with everything you said, Catherine, but you know, in our conversation in the past, I'm much more, I tend not to lean into the legislative direction because I feel like it's harder, but I agree with you.
It doesn't have to be the legislative direction. Everybody has to do what gives them energy. So, you know, you could be starting a farmer's market. You could be gardening. You could be whatever you need to do to build local resilience and to network with other people that create local resilience and shift the money and the time and support out of the pro-centralization team into decentralizing. Everybody should do what gives them energy.
That's what I said. I agree with you. It's my point. But I mean, just prefacing what I'm about to say by the fact that's why I tend not to lean that direction. So that being a good thing to do, and I agree everyone should be doing it. However, I think in my opinion, the primary directive is or direction from like a Larkin Rose, Derek Bros kind of perspective is to act in vote with your dollar in that sense. So I would say don't go to the UFC, not because you don't like it or you don't want to support the UFC, but that's how you vote in this world right now, right? You don't go or whatever else and that's what Catherine's saying. You prove to them that's more important to you, but also
you heard Ryan Christian just pirate that like a regular American.
I love going to the
listen. At one point out.
my first experience with this was about a year and a half ago. And like I said, this is in Kansas City, Missouri, red state, by the way, everybody, where I went to Illinois. And it was just before they were going to have the DNC there. I went to the venue with cash in my hand, thinking I could get a physical ticket. When I went to the booth, they said, no. And they made me do it through a text message, and a QR code would not accept my money. Then inside, I can't get a pretzel for money.
It's every Major League Baseball event now. It's every major sporting event is like that. No cash, have to have a QR code, have to download the app. It's like whether or not you're being conscious of it, you're being herded into this digital control grid. And it's going to take a whole lot of people to go, hey, wait a minute, that's dumb. No, I'd rather not. I'd rather not do that. This seems completely ridiculous before anybody's going to balk. But we got to make them balk. We really do.
I think
what's ironic about that, of course, is that what's going to remain still a cash business is going to be black market weapons and drugs, and those were only created to launder money for the federal government in the first place. So they can't completely kill cash because they need it.
Yeah, Catherine had a point though. Go ahead, Catherine.
Okay, so I'm just moving over to put this in the chat. We have a section up on our financial transaction freedom website called Turtling for Cash. And a wonderful subscriber in South Dakota got legislation passed in the state legislature this session saying that school sports events had to take cash. And because I agree, the sports is a big place where
all right, let me stop you, Catherine. Let me stop you, because I do a platform elite. Cost me about $3,000 to $5,000 for a private. This is private, and it's EBK Sports Center. Now, when they really want to get you, and they do, and you say that there's an ATM right there. Now, most of them are cash. Twice this year, if I wanted to go to the volleyball tournament that I already paid for, they have a QR code. It is a 2-day
Right?
pass.
No, Jason, I understand that. What I'm telling you is,
You know
fine.
the rules. That's all.
First, I know about how difficult it is. What I'm telling you is,
Convenient.
I know you can raise the percentage of cash you use in your daily transactions if you want to, and it matters. You don't have to do it. It's not 0 or 1. Okay, you do thousands of transactions a year. Okay, the other thing I want to bring up, just because you're in Iowa, and I told Brian I wanted to bring this up, I just did a wonderful interview that we'll publish in 2 or 3 weeks with Pat Militek.
Oh, Militek, good buddy of mine.
Yeah, so who was a UFC champion, and he has a business called Soil Savers, which I think could rock the world because he's figured out basically how to spread probiotics on your land that can heal a lot of chemical damage and a lot of toxicity. And it's quite remarkable. So they're,
Pat's a very good friend and a very smart guy. And we actually went and saw a film together last week, Soil Saviors. Again, that goes back to even the geoengineering and what we're putting in our bodies and what we're breathing and eating.
Right. But that could really help. So Pat likes to just do it. He doesn't want to go deal with the state legislator. So, so his thing is to just do it, and it's great. But, imagine we got a bill passed in Tennessee, the first state that stopped geoengineering. When Daniel Goodrich brought that legislation to the state, I said, you got a 1% chance of getting this passed. And she got it passed and signed into law, and I'll tell you why.
I was there 3 weeks ago, and they're still spraying.
Of course, because you can't enforce unless, I'm going to slap you guys around the head here. So she took it. I said, you got no chance, but sometimes it takes 7 years of breaking down the walls to get a good enforcement going in Tennessee. So some guy from California came to lobby against the bill, and he starts lobbying about how it'll cut into his profits. And suddenly all these legislators said, oh my God, I thought this was a conspiracy theory. And he completely freaked them out, and they ended up passing the bill. Now, it's a first step, and it needs many more steps, but they can only enforce unless you take off and land in Tennessee.
Or the different layers of the elevation too.
But if you look at how we get things done in Tennessee, you pass the first bill, that's like 5%. You pass the second bill, that's 5%. And it takes years. And you've seen, Frank Nicely, who is the master legislator in Tennessee, he would take 7 to 10 years to get something really done, and it would take multiple layers of legislation. But that's part of how you educate people and get them to really change. But you got to start.
Yeah, which is my point, is that obviously is important, and I agree. We have to keep doing that, but I'd rather try to get more immediate action going while we're doing that too. You know what I mean?
Right. So absolutely. I just put in a link to our article. I want to stop CBDCs. What can I do? But it's the same. We've done a whole bunch of shows with Twyla Bras on Financial Rebellion on CHD TV about how you stop the Real ID. And I think the most important thing to stop right now is the Real ID.
Well, why don't we use that as a transition, since we really have only, gotten to the currency part of this. And, I doubt we'll get to every single data point. So I say what we focus on is next to that Real ID focus, because that's connected, and then the Stargate kind of infrastructure of it all. So on the idea of the digital ID, Real ID, say back kind of like ecosystem that's being built. I mean, from a US perspective, but it's happening everywhere as well. Anybody want to start on that? Any thoughts jump to people's minds?
I just like to ask the question out there: how do you describe it to somebody that wants to have voter ID, and explain to them that you don't necessarily need a federalized, quote unquote, Real ID? What you need are state IDs at the base that are not involved in that system. Because I think that we all want people to be citizens of the United States that vote and have a system for that. And I don't think that we're anti-identification, but when it gets to the federal level and whether or not you can travel and the embedding of these different RFID and eventually biometric systems, obviously that's what we want to push back against.
So Jason, why is the registration process not? You have a registration process wherever you are. You register to vote. That's it. That's that's your system. What?
But you know, they usually do it through the DMV, and you know, they also lie to you all the time and tell you that if you don't get this specific identification,
No, but I mean, why does anybody think you need another ID
The law's already
to
there.
protect election fraud?
Yeah.
I mean,
I
election fraud
agree
is a
with you. How do
problem,
you-
but it's got nothing to do with the absence of IDs.
But how do you convey that to people? And then when you go into states like New York or California, et cetera, that are inherently corrupt, even Illinois, which is right, I mean, like it's a mile away from me. Yeah, well, you're right. But I mean, obviously those ones to me are more important because it doesn't allow you to take charge at the local level, right? For your senators, your congressmen, your state senators, a lot of that. And, you know, I don't believe that New York is necessarily a blue state. You know, as much as I don't like Lee Zeldin, I have a hard time believing that Kathy Hochul won in a free and fair election, right? So how do we get a system of quote unquote voter ID that is essentially federalized? And I'm not saying you can't do this, but convey it through state IDs. You know as well as I do in New York, I mean, they push you right through on that. I was showing my buddy my you know, it was the enhanced license that got me into Canada or Mexico. And, you know, my Iowa ID is a little bit different, but I did get the federal one that has the star in it. Most people don't even know that you have an option to opt out of that and just get a regular state ID. So is this just
not after May 7th, as I understand?
Yeah. Is this just we have to get the information out and then we have to just actually enforce the laws that are already on the books and express that to people that we don't need to see?
I would say if the question is how do I show someone that wants digital ID to stop voter fraud, you know, what would be a good thing to show them, to explain to them why that's not necessary? Maybe show them that video of Elon Musk speaking about 6 months ago, saying how important it was that all voting was done with a paper bureaucracy, because that would cut out the potential for voter fraud. So while he wants voting process itself to be done using manual counts, as in human beings checking bits of paper that someone's put a cross in, because he considers that to be far safer than using any kind of digital system, why not then, if that's his idea, why does he not also advocate having, you know, traditional types of registration done through a human run bureaucracy? So, you know, for years and years we have paper driving licenses. So why don't we? What if the issue is security, then what's wrong with paper driving licenses? They seem to be far more secure than digital driving licenses. So,
hold on, Jason. Hold on. Let me jump in since I want to get in for that first point. So the idea here is that, and I agree with you, it's important to highlight that, you know, people I'm sure disagree, so we shouldn't say everybody, but anybody who wants to uphold the law in this regard would say that you have to have an ID to vote and that has to be verified. That's obvious, right? So I think we agree with that. The point, though, is that this is a manufactured problem to justify the solution they want. And we all know that's how it works, right? So we're dealing with something in regard to, you know, the point is, as Catherine was alluding to, there's laws in the books already. And, you know, I'm not a statist, so the idea is we're forced to live in this regard. And so that's what we're discussing. But the point is, those laws are on the books that already apply to this problem. So the idea is that if the issue of immigration has been applied to rationalize why we need something new, all we need is the current enforcement. And I'll point out Democrats who are actively avoiding that or arguing that we shouldn't be. And so that's the problem, not that we need a new layer of things for them to ignore, right, to justify the new digital ID. So that's the bigger thing for me. So I just want to lay that out there because I think the solution being presented is a bait and switch. So,
but let me just say this also, because again, you know, I voted this year, and I'm in Iowa, and yes, again, I had an ID, but then we talk about paper verification, right? And the polling was not paper. So now they've brought in this new system where I sign on a pad with my finger that looks almost nothing like, you know, my actual signature, but that verifies me, and then I get my paper ballot. So it you know, again, we have so many things to do to push back. I want the paper system all the way through, right? So in other words, the ballot I get, and I don't even think I sign that, right? So that doesn't have my signature on it. So it would be very, very easy to go in there as somebody else with something, you know, they barely looked at I don't even know they looked at my ID, I'll be honest. I think I said my name, they asked me my address, and maybe I handed somebody my ID for a second, and then I digitally signed. I'm with you. I want all paper all the time. I want physical identification, etc. But again, I think the issue is, even with that, are we going to have the same type of corruption in these states where this absolutely happens? Because we still have, you talked about the machines, we still have the damn machines counting these things with fractional voting. You're right. You know, like that's a whole nother. I don't know that the SAVE Act does anything to stop that, but I would ask, what is the solution to get to? I mean, we're so close to the midterms right now. Forget about, 2028, 2026 is right around the corner. And at least in this country, I think that does make a significant difference. So I'll open the floor to anybody that wants to retort to that.
Well, I'll just add before anybody else jumps in that I think the point again is that, and not that I necessarily agree with the laws in the books, but the laws that are there to be enforced would already address the problem. And that's kind of what we always keep seeing, is that they're just like even with I don't want to lurch into some larger conversation, but the idea that they're putting things forward and trying to solve the problem when the problem is just simply already acknowledging the law that's existing. And I think that's a constant game that's being played. So I think we all agree with that problem, but the solution should not be a digital ID, or really the real ID compliance, or really the bigger point for those that don't think it's digital ID, a national identification. We've all talked about that as a conspiracy topic and how tied that is with the New World Order and all these different conversations. So it's interesting that it finally gets pushed forward by the people that would otherwise be calling it out, which is how this always seems to go. So that's, I think, important.
Well, in town, it parallels gun laws, doesn't it? People say we need stricter gun laws because of criminals using guns, but there are already laws to stop criminals using guns, and they ignore them. So you bring in stricter voting rules, and the people that break the voting rules will just break the voting rules. I mean, they ignore the rules already. New laws aren't going to make any difference.
Right. And I think that's the crux of it, is that if you're addressing it, Jason, is that, what's going to stop them? Nothing. And corruption does not stop because of a new law passed, like you're talking about. They're already corrupt. So they're going to find their ways around it as best they can. That's why just the point is to acknowledge that they're violating that instead of trying to go around it, but that's how government works, it seems. But, so I think that's, before I go to the next part, anybody else have any comments on that discussion point? Okay, so let's jump in then to the point that, the connection to that, which is the, I guess, the larger database, as you wrote and I'll bring it up to kind of set the point, as you wrote in the article, financial data and payment systems and artificial intelligence. So again, there's so many connection points to all this. And you just wrote the summary: to build a digital control grid, digital IDs must link with programmable money and interoperable systems across multiple platforms, integrated with social credit and surveillance systems. And that is Stargate, essentially. So kind of what we already went over in a lot of ways, but any other points to start that off?
The only thing that I would say technology-wise that wasn't covered in this article, I would say, is the artificial skin that is constantly being put up by the Defense Department and SpaceX, right? So, we talk about in this the doorbell cams and that type of surveillance. But when you look at what Starlink really is, it is that global digital information skin. And, the ride-along program on SpaceX used to put up the Blackjack satellites. I know that Derek actually did a couple of extensive pieces talking about the new spy satellite network that has been directly created by Musk. So if I were to just interject anything into this, it's that we have the militarization and the surveillance of space going to an extremely new level. And what they're selling the public on is Katy Perry going 60 miles up to the Kármán line and the idea that we're going to Mars. Like, Trump literally said it, I think, 2 days ago again, that we better get to Mars before the end of our administration. None of that's real. These rocket systems are Defense Department programs, and they fully want to integrate this information system, this information skin, into not just the Internet of Things, but the Internet of Bodies. And let me just say this about the Internet of Things. We are starting to see that mini revolution in the United States of self-driving cars. Phoenix is a big hub for this, and I did not know it. My buddy went out there a couple weeks ago and took one of the robot cabs. They're everywhere there, So we're now starting to see the automation steps of this control grid come into fruition, at least on a smaller scale. And I think a lot of that is going to be driven by the technology that is in the sky and really not talked about that much. I mean, even when you think about the people that were sitting there at the inauguration, Bezos is sitting there, right? Well, Bezos also is another one of these guys, Amazon, are building these artificial intelligence information centers and trying to opt for this nuclear technology as well. So this is a big part of the fourth industrial revolution that people aren't talking about: the surveillance in the sky, the integration with AI on the ground, and then utilizing what I think will eventually be these mini nuke plants in order to do so.
Yeah, the World Economic Forum have already spoken about what they're calling the $1 trillion opportunity of Earth observation satellite industry. So a kind of leading technologically on that is, companies like Satellogic that Lutnick is invested in. So the idea is that we think about satellites kind of observation in terms of its physical observation, like some sort of camera looking at the ground so that you can see an image of something, but they're talking about using it for harvesting data, particularly from the Internet of Things, Internet of Bodies, bringing this together into one kind of cohesive system that will take data globally from all these devices that we're using, monitoring our energy usage. I mean, there's already they the idea of the cryptocurrency powered smart home has already been developed. So we are moving towards a point where things like the Earth observation industry is going to be a key player in kind of the management and collation and the AI analysis of that data. So the AI analysis of the data that they're going to gather on a global scale, will be worth well, the World Economic Forum call it $1 trillion opportunity, because obviously, I mean, if you're developing any kind of industry or any kind of technology, then that data will be extremely valuable. Now, we're already seeing companies like X moving into selling their user data. So they openly trade their user data. Now, supposedly it's anonymous, but nonetheless, the data that has been harvested by things like the LLMs that are harvesting up all of our kind of interactions online, and it is everything. It's every comment we make. It's this video. It's all being gathered and harvested to train these LLMs. And once those LLMs are trained, then they're going to be used for, and similar AI systems are going to be used to analyze the data that is gathered by things like the Earth observation satellite systems. So, I think that one of the things that they're doing at the moment is that there are a number of competing technologies that they're playing off against one another to see which one comes out on top. Now, a lot of that will be down to investment, but a lot of that will also be down to kind of technological efficiency as well. So when they've got a cohesive system and a winner emerges, then that will be a kind of monopoly on the data that they are gathering. And then they've already talking about the concept both in the both financial and digital ID of this notion of the universal ledger, which will be a centralized ledger of all data. So I mean, that is the ultimate kind of centralization of authority if you've got access to that data. Funnily enough, it's being sold to us as decentralization. So all these new systems that are coming out are being these competitive systems that are decentralized, and there's all these vendor agnostic companies that are competing because it's just a kind of free for all that's going to enable a brave new world. Unfortunately, the nature of that decentralization is, if you like, creating nodes on a blockchain network that is going to enable the centralization of particularly the analysis of all that data. That's what they're constructing.
So I just wanted to mention one thing, because I don't see how this vision works in terms of energy consumption unless you bring out breakthrough energy or you depopulate, or both.
Or both, yeah. I mean,
Hard to do both.
they're already talking about, in order to meet the projected, and it's the international IEE EEE, I can't remember what that stands for, but their last kind of assessment report of where we would be by 2050. I think currently the total global use is something like 26. I'm going to get this horribly wrong. 26 million gigawatt hours. per year, and that's gonna double to, you know, more than 50 by 2050, which they've calculated is the equivalent of adding a nation like Japan to the energy consumption every year between now and 2050. So that's the scale of the energy increase, the energy generation increase that we would need if this was actually going to happen. Which means, as you quite rightly say, there's only two parts of that equation, Catherine, isn't there? There's either got to be a hell of a lot more nuclear power stations or some sort of fundamental energy breakthrough, or
Well, they've
less
had
of
the
us.
breakthrough. They've had the breakthroughs. They just haven't applied them. Well,
Yeah.
it's not just less of us, but we see multiple people talking about how they're going to be live to 145. We saw the president's son-in-law say his generation was going to be the last to die, or we're going to live forever. So, you know, so that's even more environmental stress. Let me just mention one thing. I was looking at a group. So I have a investment screen company. I was looking at a list of the stocks that had performed the best over the last year, just out of curiosity. One was a software company. I ended up going in, and it turned out that one of their lines of business was digitizing the forest. So they were planning on spraying sensors, you know, like on the entire Amazon, and collecting data on every living thing in the forest. It was called Internet of Forests. And I just said, you know, these guys have every ruse you can think of to create and suck up data. It's unbelievable.
That's insane. I've never heard that. I mean, that's just that has
do a search for the Internet of Forests. You'll pick it up.
Well, I was going to make that point actually before I go to something else. Is that what's interesting is the Internet of Bodies is actually the old conversation, right? So this is from 2019, right? And so they're talking about the Internet of Bodies, the Internet of Things with the interconnection. Like we're beyond even this, where I think Internet of bio nano things, and like so we're getting to the point to where we're still being pointed to something. It's always like the deflection, right? They give you what was happening 20 years ago while they're moving on to something else. And I think that's what this really is, because well beyond that, and you can't do what you're talking about with the trees without something like smart dust.
Right.
Yeah. That's wild. And so that really shows you. So let's bring that to the larger kind of what I see as the Palantir or whatever you want. I think Palantir is the obvious point. Oracle's obviously involved, but the total information awareness, CIA overlap, Palantir, where we're seeing this sort of all-encompassing, as we've been highlighting in every aspect, this consolidation of information, of surveillance. I mean, I've got many things pulled up of like the IRS overlap, the immigration OS they rolled out, you know, all these different massive consolidations of controlled surveillance and information.
Right.
So let's kind of end on that general point. I don't know how much time you have, Catherine, if you want to start.
So I've got 1 minute. So, you know, I think it's a little bit like the old stories of the gold rush, where everybody sees an opportunity to make money by centralizing and creating more data and centralizing. And we do know, I've been told many times that the guy who has the best AI is the one who can provide it with the most highest quality data, because it really develops on the data. And so, you know, this is part of a gold rush. And of course it's allowed because carrots and sticks, it takes you where the centralizers want to go. But I do want to point out that, you know, whether it's the energy question or many other questions, I just see that the centralizers have enormous problems. This is going to turn into one of the greatest cluster, I mean, it already is. And I think that's why what Derek said about, focus on the actions you can take and building local resilience and just doing it every time you can just do it. If enough people do that, it has tremendous opportunity, because I think their vision, it as an economic matter and as a matter in alignment, well, it just doesn't make sense. This is way too psychopathic to work. So I just, I mean, I can see why everybody's rushing for the gold rush, but at some point, just remember the guys who made money on the gold rush were the guys who made the blue jeans.
Right.
So anyway, gentlemen, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much, Ryan, for doing this. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it, because the more we can help people see the overall picture, I think the more people who will start to, look for real solutions and back out. Anyway.
Absolutely. And great work on this, and looking forward to the next one, Catherine. So thanks for joining.
Have a great day.
Thanks,
Well,
Catherine.
I would just like to add on top of that, in the interesting, what Catherine said, doesn't that make you worry that maybe this is the worse version that hides the one that comes? It's usually how that feels, right? Where it's like they're showing you this crazy idea, so people go no to that, and then quietly roll out the one that's a little less bad behind it. I don't know. Just any thoughts on her last point there?
I mean, obviously with the Internet of Bodies stuff, that's something you mentioned. Smart dust. Well, we're in year 20 plus of that being like used by the military industrial complex openly during barely talked about. And I think that that's a big problem. I would encourage people to go read a book now. I think that's about a decade old. I think it might even be 2013. And that is First Platoon by Annie Jacobson. And that story actually revolves around smart dust and its utilization by a unit in Iraq to target a quote unquote terrorist threat that they end up at the last minute not killing based on this technology that would have been the wrong one. I do want to talk about AI-based killing because we've been mentioning Palantir and we've been mentioning Peter Thiel. Probably my clip of the year so far is when Peter Thiel gets asked about lavender and the Israelis using that to target, 34,000 quote unquote terrorists. And Thiel is extremely, the most uncomfortable I think I've ever seen him in my life on video. His face gets beet red. He stutters. He stammers. You can see the inflection in his voice and in the way his jaw is moving, that he's very uncomfortable with that question. Because when you do peel back any of the basic layers of who they targeted, it was basically people that were in group chats, right? People that knew people that were supposedly quote unquote Hamas terrorists. And then you look at the overall military targeting. We have to remember, the IDF utilized the technology that blew people up in broad daylight in public in non-military situations. Is this what we want to promote with Palantir and Lavender? And even more crass, and I would say openly militaristic, is his right-hand man in this Palantir project, aka Alex Karp. He's the one going to the consumer electronics shows. He's the one talking about these things, very, very blasé. And I think also about 6 months, he just bragged openly how this thing was going to be utilized globally, and they're the ones that have oversight, period. And as well as I do, that doesn't mean the quote unquote United States has oversight. This is a company that is heavily embedded in Five Eyes, which means what? Israel, the United States, the United Kingdom, really are allies as well on top of Australia and Canada, right? Because when we talk about what's going on in Yemen, do you think Palantir is not involved there? I mean, come on.
So together basically in every field of war that we can see right now.
And that is extremely problematic, not just because it's being utilized overseas, but because it's also being utilized domestically. And the question is, how much more implementation of that are we going to see now that we've legitimized this idea that even gang members in the United States are part of terrorist groups?
People accused of being gang members in many cases without any due process or verification. So that adds to that point where you can just go, this is what I think it is. And people are literally going, that's enough. The president can decree that you're something with no due process and get rid of you. Or like you're saying, maybe a drone strike. These are real.
This is why I've always said we don't just blot. Criminals are criminals, right? This terrorist word is utterly been overused, not just through the Trump administration, but even before that. And we've kind of placated this idea of domestic terrorists, right? There's a whole subsection of conservatives that want to call Antifa a terroristic organization. It's like, whoa, buddy. Again, if an individual or a group commits crimes, that does not necessarily make them terrorists. And when you take the word terrorist, you are taking out, like you said, all of due process. And that
let's even just go back to the word criminal, though, right? Because it's the same principle, right? Whether you're accused of being a criminal or a terrorist, the point is, whether it's an illegal alien or anything else under the Constitution, therefore due process to prove those things. And so I think this is a really good overlap to what we're talking about with this Palantir or whatever else, Oracle aspect. We're discussing surveillance identification, cataloging of information that then is used against you in ways where potentially, as we're seeing, as Trump has floated 5 times now, the idea of sending Americans to a foreign prison, and so this obviously comes, and we don't have to get into that larger conversation unless you want to, but it clearly overlaps, seeing as how Palantir is using the justification of highlighting people in immigration and surveillance, and it's all building in the same direction, even if people agree with the outcome of this or how they're doing it, which I think is flatly unconstitutional. But it's an
I think an interesting thing about the conversation about what the Doge has been doing is that I can't remember who wrote the article, but they described it as post-human. Because they were using AI essentially to decide whether someone was efficient or not, and then potentially firing them based on an AI made decision, which is if you apply that kind of same thing to the notion of whether or not somebody is, which they are doing, the notion of whether or not somebody is quote unquote a terrorist, or whether they should be deported for alleged criminal activity based upon an AI assessment of available data, then we are moving into, it is not unreasonable to say that we are moving into a post-human world, because those are the kind of decisions that surely must be taken, as you were saying, Ryan, as following a due process, not based on AI's assessment of a due process. And one thing I think that we are in very much danger of in all this conversation about AI is overestimating its actual capability.
Yes, or lying about it.
Yeah, because I mean, we are being told that it's capable of so much, but it's also incapable of a tremendous amount. Things that human beings can do in a split fraction of a second, AI is nowhere near capable of doing. So we are being kind of led into this idea that ultimately there will be a singularity. There will be this point where AI becomes sentient. There's no reason to think that isn't something that is on the horizon at all. What we've got is massive data harvesting and analytical programming of programs that assess that data. It might be highly complex and it might be able to mimic things like human speech, but it's not some sort of amazing kind of aid to the kind of forward march of humankind. It's quite the opposite. So there's no reason why we would ever want to even contemplate the idea of a post-human future. Why would we as human beings ever contemplate that?
Yeah, it's the Great Reset, the MAGA Great Reset, or whatever's happening now.
Ryan, there was a couple points that I did want to jump in on what you said, because I think that when you're talking about exiling criminals or rounding them up, first of all, under the guise of immigration, I'm much less sympathetic to people that aren't United States citizens, and I'll just put that outright. However, if you're going to deport them, you don't send them to Guantanamo Bay. Okay. And for me, that is a big issue, that you have a black site involved in any of this process, right? And I do not like the legitimization of something that should have been shut down, which should never have been reactivated in the manner it was post-war of terror. A facility that still holds Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other accused 9/11 member 20 plus years later, and the public had some kind of a problem and outrage that they might have cut a deal with them when we didn't see any of the evidence presented, when we didn't see what was going on in these military tribunals, when you can outwardly say, obviously, they did not get due process in the case of a fast trial, as we're 20 plus years later. And now bringing that into the immigration process, one, like you just said, is heavily automated. You know that it's heavily automated. You're 100% right with Doge. And I think that people need to understand that process has been going on for a very long time. And actually, there have been specific units in NASA. I used to play videos of the guy talking about this, how like every 8 to 16 months, they would bring people in with the next level of artificial intelligence. And essentially, these people would train half the amount of the staff by those people that would then be let go in favor of this automation and AI promise, right? And when we look at AI, the next realm of AI is going to be essentially driven by quantum computing, Microsoft just announced their first commercial quantum chip, if you haven't seen it. There are new breakthroughs with Google and NASA in AI. They've been working on this in two plus decades. And as far as he talks post-human, I think one of the next pushes in the quote-unquote transhumanist movement is to integrate human biological tissue into a lot of these operations to dehumanize us further via organoids. Are you guys familiar with the organoid movement right now?
I'm not. No. But I'd like to jump in back to the first point you made, and we can come back to that because I think we can end with this general idea of this overlapping transhumanist kind of direction that seems to go in. But I think that it's important that these two things are together because Ian's point with the artificial intelligence, the idea of how it's being automated, where it's going to a point to where we can then, like even as Eric Schmidt said in a podcast like years ago, paraphrasing, that one point we'll get to a future where AI is making decisions that may seem immoral, but it'll know better. That is what he said on a podcast a while back, which is horrifying, is that we need to establish now that these basic fundamental realities, right? The idea is sending someone to El Salvador or anywhere else, let's be clear, illegal immigrant or American, there's no basis in law precedent of any kind. That's illegal. Now, we could have that discussion going forward. It seems you agree with that, whether that could change, but right now that's the reality. But sympathy is not required to have somebody to have their constitutional rights acknowledged, right? So an illegal immigrant, let's make this clear for those watching, has constitutional rights, most importantly, due process. That's been ruled on by the Supreme Court countless times, Reno versus Flores. Scalia himself said it was paramount that in regard to deportation in particular, due process was paramount. Judge Knapp's been talking about this a lot. The reality is you can just ask Rock in generalized, it'll tell you that. The point is that it's weird we have a conversation today, people out there online, not saying anybody here, is arguing that immigrants don't have constitutional rights. I find that insane because it's simply not true. So bringing back to the point about how it's being used, this is what I think is important, is that they know people have been conditioned to be less sympathetic about certain circumstances. So they use that to get people to accept the undermining of their rights, rather than lack of acknowledgement. And so all of that together is super important because we're being edged into a position where AI is going to start making those decisions based on the precedents that they're making now. And I think that's wildly dangerous, right? So I think that larger conversation needs to be had about the manipulation of these things that are fundamental now for the technocratic society that they're building around us as we go forward. So take that wherever you'd like. And
that's just considering that the AI system works as it's supposed to work. And I use technology all the time and it doesn't. You're, in this automated system, you're a comma or a typo away from being convicted of a crime that you didn't commit, but somebody with a name very like yours did, or something like that. And this is something nobody is willing to really think about: is that there are limits to competence and there are limits to capabilities, and that itself is a threat. There isn't just a malignant, deliberate, proactive threat. There is the threat of a system that doesn't recognize the importance of the human element.
Yeah. Well, and I'll add one more thing to it in general is that, again, where it's going is that if we're at a point where a power structure can simply go, you are this thing, right? You are an illegal alien, let's say, and be able to remove you without process. Why couldn't that just happen to an American? And go, oopsie, now he's away, because there was no process in which they had to prove that was the case. These are very basic fundamental things that we're losing sight of in the world today. And I think it's designed to get us okay with that before we have this massive shift into something where, we're now dealing with machines or algorithms or whatever we're talking about, as James discussed, algocracy, right? Which is where this is going, But to bring it back to your larger point, Jason, is that the overlap to all of this transhumanist technocratic future that they're definitely pushing us into, all the points on her article showing how this is happening under this administration. But to be clear, it's not unique to partisanship. It's been going on for a very long time. So let's end on that. Organoids you brought up and different points around that.
Yeah. So, I just kind of want to end on, I often talk about the other end of transhumanism, right? Like human beings merging with technology, whether that's brain-computer interfaces or other types of tech. They've now kind of reverse engineered that. So what organoids are is that you take mitochondrial stem cells and then you grow artificial brain tissue that is then integrated into traditional electronics. And I know this sounds totally wild, but they've already, again, been creating these things for over half a decade. In fact, you can get a kit. And I played the stem cell lab kit. Here's how they do it. And it's a lot of CRISPR tech and things like that.
Your Boys Life magazine. No, I'm just kidding.
If you go watch the video, the music, I am bobbing and weaving. It's very much like that. So I had a conversation with Greg Autry of NASA about this, because they're also utilizing this technology on the ISS. Here's how commercialized it's become. And I had no idea about this guy. I'd never heard of him before. Alvin Lucier. This guy was a very experimental composer, where even in 1965, in a public forum, he had electrodes put onto his brain, and from his brain waves, he was able to conduct a full kind of like orchestra. You know, is it super impressive? Yeah, somewhat. I mean, the drums are going, you know, it's something to behold. He's been dead for 4 years. They did this process where they took his stem cells, created the organoids, and 2 weeks ago, they had a live concert of supposedly, and I don't know how much hokum this is. It's a private video if you want to actually watch it, but you can see the post and there's news articles on it, where this dead person, his, you know, mitochondrial stem cell brain tissue had its own concert 4 years posthumous. So I think they're going to try to legitimize this technology with the quantum technology and the other things moving forward as they try to integrate us into the machines. And I think what this does is this dehumanizes us further, and it puts less and less emphasis on our biological realities. That's all I'll say about it.
Yeah. I mean, I think we all see different parts of that. How soon, you know, tends to be that they make it look like something that's 20, 40 years away, but it's going to happen in a week, you know, but we have to just pay attention to these things, right? Because these are definitely, I would argue, I guess, at least in the narrative or the presentation, is that that's a little bit more on the fringe of the conversation, but that usually in my mind means that there's more of that happening than anything else. You know, it's just pay attention to how alarming these things are and how much is tied in with these central players in the background, in the different studies. Like even going back to people like, you know, Charles Lieber, Bob Langer, and the COVID timeframe. You know, the stuff they've been working on, like Jason's talking about, goes back a long way, and it does dovetail with things like nanotechnology and optogenetics, and you know, and I actually think we're well beyond that today. That's what we were seeing like 10, 15 years ago. So yeah, definitely worth conversation. Do you guys have anything you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the you know, when you got someone like Thiel, who's you know, very close to this notion of the Dark Enlightenment and very close to Yavin, it's tempting to think that our futures that they may have in mind, where we meld with technology, will be somehow beneficial for us. I mean, on its face, they would argue that we need to do this neo-reactionary movement is very much a part of, would argue that we need to do this in order to be able to cope with the singularity that they say is inevitable. But when you look more deeply into it, where you know, one of the kind of foremost thinkers in that neo-reactionary movement, a guy called Nick Land, calls us technoplastic beings. And the reason that he wants us to become technoplastic beings is so that we can pay our sovereign rent. Because in the post singularity world that they warn against but are hell bent on creating, that you know, one of the problems they'll have with new kinds of industry and new kinds in an AI controlled system, you know, with perhaps more limited employment, is how are we the people who Nick Land calls inarticulate proles, Thiel calls us the unthinking demos. How are we going to be useful? So we need to merge into this system that they've got in mind, basically as kind of like subroutines in the overall program that will be running their technocracy. So I think it's important to stress that the people that are pushing this, we might call them the neo-reactionaries or the technocrats or whatever you want to call them, they despise humanity. They are of the traditional eugenicist, useless eater persuasion. That's how they envisage where we will be in the future. And I think going back to something you said, Ryan, about this kind of notion of bait and switch. So let's take the issue of digital ID. I think a big part of the Trump administration's success has been because in terms of election success and in terms of the popular support that he's enjoyed, is because people thought that, you know, he represented something, you could call it techno-populist, where they're standing up to the global overreach of things like the WEF and, you know, the UN and these kind of organizations, which Americans are fed up of being under the kind of rule of groups like the World Health Organization and so forth. And so he makes all these bold statements and pulls the US out of organizations like that and out of the Paris Accords and all this kind of thing to much fanfare, and everybody agrees. But the problem is, if you're a globalist that wants to sell digital ID to a population, it's pretty easy. If you know, let's say that if we use the traditional kind of political kind of spectrum that we're given, left and right, let's say that you've already convinced the left that they need to adopt digital ID in order to stay safe. They need to adopt digital ID so that their carbon footprints can be tracked. They need to adopt digital ID so that they don't die of a disease if they cross a border. The sell has already been relatively successful for the traditional left, that I would argue. How do you get the liberty-minded, small c conservative, traditional right on board with that? Well, you just sell them the same product, but instead of saying that it's for protecting the planet, you say it's to fight illegal immigration.
Right.
It's the same product. It's just a different sales pitch. So that's really what I, how I see what's happening is happening. It's, the notion of the freedom city. There's no difference between the notion of a freedom city and a 15-minute city. One comes from the globalist, so-called quote unquote globalist elite, and one comes from the new neo-reactionary elite. But it's the same thing. A 15-minute city and a freedom city are the same thing. So, it's people get on board because they're behind the person that is selling them the idea. Not that the idea is fundamentally any different. It isn't.
This is why I tend to think at least in this country, but really anywhere in the world, the false binary, which doesn't always have to be two, despite the name, like, the idea of that concept clearly is the biggest block to any real change, like especially in the United States, speaking as American. Like, it is so obviously, like you're talking about, there's people that would otherwise be pushing back, and then they flip the script and they do it a little different way. And then, and it continues to oscillate like that. And right now with this administration, which I see is no different than the previous, just the continuation, a different way for a new flavor, is doing all that through it with all of these different agendas, whether it's bringing down the failed thing we all start to see to, make it look as if change is happening, to really just replace it with something worse, or the repackaging of the same problem with a different cell. It's literally everywhere. And that's why it's so important for people to look beyond, not their ideals and values that they may see as conservative or liberal, but like the larger politicized team sport politics of it all, because it is, you think about the woke mind virus, it's a partisan mind virus. It's literally in our face everywhere. That's my opinion, speaking for myself. But, I think that's a very good point to kind of wrap on in general. But you guys, any other points you guys want to include on that? I was just going to rattle off some things on the article before we wrap up today. Or nothing to shout out, nothing else, guys. All right. Well, I'm just going to generally point out, make sure. What's funny as we started, like the point was, and I don't know why I didn't immediately recognize this would not happen for how much we have to talk about, but to go through each one of these data points and discuss the issues and also the solutions around them. But we got to the digital money part of it, and there's plenty more, as you noticed, in the part. I hope you all see the war on cash, digital monetary system, financial disclosure, the Doge overlap, the failures so far of the different things that haven't happened, Real ID, Stargate, and then, of course, you got into internet bodies we briefly touched on, but the assets part, which we didn't get to, which I looked at Catherine's work. It's really important to understand how this, the Lutnick part of this and the financial side of it is playing out in regard to the tariff overlap, as well as she highlights, and the kind of lie around it. Also, the energy discussion, as she points, drill, baby, energy policy from Trump, but also the budget in general, which is what I was just saying about the tariff overlap and how it seems to be offset by other actions that are being taken. And, hey, maybe it'll end up positive, but to wonder whether that was always kind of the plan is the point. But then she also has others at the bottom: election fraud, organized crime, weather warfare, geoengineering, as we were referencing before. A well-written article, and I would argue she herself would point out that this itself doesn't even truly address the real scope of this problem. There's many other points we could include. But thank you all for joining today. And, anything else you want to leave on the way out in general? I think it's a good time to discuss these things. Thank you all for being here.
I'd also just say she did throw in the Epstein files, and I think a good assessment there. There's a whole nother ball of corruption that, I mean, people should be being prosecuted for the evidence that they're going through. And since we're not seeing that, look, I don't think we're going to see those files in full, because if we did, obviously it would have to be preceded by real indictments, real criminal trials, and then prosecutions for that evidence to come into the public arena. So I would just encourage people to read this. But realize, like you said, no matter how extensive it is, I mean, we just talked for 2 hours on a lot of points that were not even included in this, and we could have gone on for a much longer period of time.
Yeah.
I'd just like to reiterate what Catherine said as well during our conversation earlier, and that is that it's not an all or nothing situation that we find ourselves in. We can make decisions every day in our lives that move us towards the destination that we want to go in. That may mean accepting some inconvenience, and it may mean not being able to do things like go to a sports event or something like that. It might mean those kind of sacrifices, but it all amounts to what matters to you. What do you think is really, really important? And if you think that sacrificing your freedom is not important, then fine, that's a choice that you make, but then you have to live with the consequences of that. And I think that it's going to be very difficult, as something Steve was saying. Billions of people are not suddenly going to start not using their cards, and not using the and not using all the modern conveniences that they've become accustomed to. That's not going to happen. But I think if pockets of communities start building, and funnily enough, we can piggyback on something that has been suggested called the network state, because there are aspects of the network state that was written right Balaji Srinivasan that there might be something to that. So creating pockets of communities that communicate with each other's, like nodes on a network, but that exchange goods and services and trade necessarily outside of the system. That kind of thing could start building some sort of resistance to what is happening. But more importantly than that, for the people that are involved in that kind of thing, personally, you're already making a stand against the kind of encroaching tyranny. So it's not all or nothing. We still have to use our cards if we buy something from Amazon, but we can use cash.
You still buy from Amazon?
Just before the show.
yeah. But so we can make a difference by focusing on what we do every day.
Here.
Yeah. I would also like to add to really just bring something back that Catherine did say just before she left. She says she doesn't think it's possible that they can do what they want to do, and I would tend to agree. And I think it might seem sort of passive compared to other solutions, but I genuinely think, as much as I pointed out incompetence as a threat, incompetence is also a source for optimism. I simply don't think they have the ability to do the system they want to implement on a full wide scale and have it be foolproof. I'm a big believer in the War of the Worlds defense, which is that essentially they will be rejected. Like spoiler alert for War of the Worlds, but in the end, the aliens are killed by bacteria from this planet, not by us. They just can't live here. And I don't believe that this system can exist. I don't think it can be there and not have people simply slip through the cracks and be left alone.
Yeah.
And I really do. I mean, I see it all the time. People will simply go on without it.
I certainly hope you're right. And I do think it's worth, at least leaning into in hopes that that's the reality. But, I think the problem is whether they're trying to change the reality of our world, our existence, in order to make that be able to be possible. You know what I mean? Like, we're watching a transformation of the human species, if they're at least the attempts therein in the long-term plan. So I think the whole point is that in every possible way that we can, if you recognize this problem, it behooves us to try to make a difference in our lives. If it's the smallest things, whether it's voting with your dollar or speaking out about this, starting your own show, or completely pulling out of society, all these things are things out there to consider, or just, talking about these things. I will and point of the Catherine point with Steve again, it's interesting is that it's easy to fall into the idea, the belief, and maybe it's right that no one's going to do that. People are lazy. They don't want to do it because we know that's a large portion of this conversation. But I do always lean in, even if it's just wishful thinking. And I do think I see it, the writing on the wall everywhere. I think we all do. That at least a rapidly growing number of people are beginning to question basic fundamental things of the control structure. And I think, again, that's largely why this is a time for them to transition to something new. So I think it's worth leaning into that. And I think we should give humanity the benefit of the doubt in a lot of ways historically, that I think people are better than we give them credit for. And I think that the system knows that, which is why it's always presenting itself as good and altruistic and fighting for freedom and liberty when they don't have to, right? If they believe that we were all bad, then why would they want, I think it shows the game. But I'll end with, in general, about the where we are now. That I think what keeps happening is the partisan game flip-flops. And one side points to the other, and calls for accountability, never wanting the full accountability. So right now, as we see this go forward, I think a lot of people are like, why is Bill Gates or Fauci or anybody else, or as you pointed out, all the different things that we know of Epstein, or they were telling, these people are stealing Social Security numbers. Why is anybody in jail? There's so many different points being made about things that you claim you can prove. And this isn't unique to Trump. This is a partisan thing. The idea that clearly there should have been something happening by now. There should have been something happening in Biden's administration, but it doesn't. It progresses. So that doesn't mean you have to completely disillusion yourself or break all the views you have, but just recognize what that shows you, that ultimately that this is not going, at least right now, in the direction that they're always telling you it's going to, and at least ask why that may be. And then go through Catherine's article, and hopefully you'll put the dots together. But thank you all for tuning in today, and I'm looking forward to some more IMA panels coming up soon. We have the website still being built from Odysee at the moment, and it has been delayed a bunch, but there's a lot going on there. So hopefully that'll be out soon. And from TLAV side of it, thank you all. As always, question everything. Come to your own conclusions. Stay vigilant.